Hello and welcome to this video in which we will step back in time to March 1997 and have a look at the launch of the N64 from the UK's perspective, and this is with the help of a supplement that was given away with the Edge gaming magazine. Prepare to discover the N64's origins, the best games at launch, beta game details and the cancelled games. The N64 was a joint effort between Californian-based Silicon Graphics, aka SGI, and Japan-based Nintendo, and its main competitors were the Sony PlayStation 1 and Sega Saturn. Edge seems optimistic that Nintendo would be the gameplay king, although we know from hindsight that Sony took the crown in terms of units sold. But the N64 managed a very respectable second place. The N64 was loosely based on Silicon Graphics' Onyx Reality Engine 2, which was capable of 10 million polygons per second, but cost £179,000 at the time. That's £333,165 or $471,784 in today's money. Later, a cost-reduced version of the Reality Engine, the Multimedia Engine, was developed and was suitable to be used in video game consoles. Sega turned down the SGI offering, so the Sega 64 never became a reality. But in August 1993, it was Nintendo that entered a contract with SGI to use the technology to build a games console. In September 1993, Project Reality became a reality, and Nintendo looked forward to their new hardware that would generate supposedly photorealistic virtual worlds. From early on, Nintendo's game developers were briefed on what exactly Project Reality would be capable of, and soon Project Reality neared launch, but now known as Ultra 64, which would later become the Nintendo 64. The N64 was released on the 23rd of June 1996 in Japan, in the US on the 29th of September 1996, and the 1st of March in Europe 1997. The N64 features a 64-bit CPU, on par with a Pentium at the time, which typically handles the logic of the game. Another 64-bit processor, the Reality coprocessor, handles the geometry transformations and rendering of the polygons. The PlayStation and Saturn were very lacking with their 3D support in comparison to the N64, missing features supported by the N64 such as anti-aliasing, which makes images look less jagged, and Z buffer support that ensure polygons appear correctly in front of each other, and perspective correct texturing, which keeps textures looking correct regardless of what angle you are looking at it. Keeping in mind that PCs at the time were also at a disadvantage, as typically they did all graphics processing and software, the first graphics card wasn't released until 1999. An important point is raised here, that people react positively to better looking textures rather than higher number of polygons, and especially back in the day, higher quality textures could hide the lack of polygons. As is often the case even today with console launches, supply of the N64 was limited, with initially only 20,000 for sale in the UK. An N64 in 1997 would set you back £250 or £465 or $659 in today's money, about the cost of a PS5 or Xbox Series X at RRP price. An N64 game would have cost at least £50, which is £93 or $131 in today's money, more expensive than even a new PS5 or Xbox Series X game. The PS1 in 1997 cost only £220, which no doubt convinced many people to go with Sony's offering. PAL N64s were at a disadvantage due to the 50Hz refresh rate, contrasted to the higher 60Hz of NTSC machines, resulting in slower running games if not compensated for, an issue not so apparent with modern game consoles. Oddly, PAL N64s were packaged with an RF modulator, supposedly to make connecting a UK N64 to a PAL TV more straightforward, as every TV would support such a connection. We take for granted today full-screen games, but back in 1997, it was common for PAL games to have large borders due to the higher resolution of PAL video compared to NTSC. Edge, however, reports that the borders are a lot smaller compared to the SNES days, with Super Mario 64 being the test example. I won't go into a huge detail about the N64 specs, clearly seen on this page, as you can pause the video and have a read if you like. The thing to understand is that for 1997, the N64 was an impressive piece of hardware, although far from what perhaps Nintendo had initially been led to believe considering what SGI hardware was capable of. A few things to add. Edge mentions that the N64 has an expansion port for the 64DD. The 64DD was a flop in Japan when released and never saw a release in other regions. The N64 cannot output RGB, which would give a much cleaner video output than RF, composite and S-video, but nowadays it's possible to mod an N64 to give RGB out, and it's a good option. The N64 has 4 controller ports, which eliminated the need for a multi-tap, but note that there were consoles before it with 4 controller ports, but they only saw a US release. That's a Bally Astrocade in 1978 and the Atari 5200 in 1982. Oddly, Edge refers to the N64's memory expansion as the 64DD memory card, but they weren't that far off. Although the jumper pack installed by default can be replaced with the expansion pack in order to enhance games that supported it, the 64DD was bundled with the expansion pack, as all 64DD software requires it. While the N64 standard controller may not have been that well received, Nintendo went through many prototypes, even a motion sensor wristwatch, before settling on a controller featuring a cross keypad, 3D analog stick, and a number of additional control buttons. Nintendo was not the first to produce a controller with an analog stick, but their offering afforded greater precision, and Nintendo beat both Sony and Sega in the release of a controller with an analog stick. A first for a game's console controller, there is an expansion port, and it sets a memory card to save game progress, or a jolting pack, aka rumble pack, for vibration feedback. Edge makes a suggestion that Nintendo will do away with controllers completely with the Nintendo 128, but as of the release of the Switch, that hasn't become reality just yet. Mario Kart 64 became the second best-selling N64 game, and in Japan only, Nintendo also released a game bundled with a black and grey controller. Super Mario 64 impressed Edge no end, calling it one of the best video games ever created. Apparently, Super Mario 64 uses about 60% of the N64's capacity, and with ROM prices dropping at the time, games can take advantage of even more space. However, Edge warned that at the time even the N64's hardware was old, and if it had been a PC it would have soon been old news. Interestingly, Edge seems concerned over the M2, a follow-up to the 3DO console by Panasonic that ended up being cancelled. With thoughts on N64 being used for more than just games, having some form of online connection, and being able to download new characters and levels like modern day DLC. The N64 would see online connectivity in Japan only via the RadNet service, along with the 64DD add-on. As for multi-region compatibility, a PAL N64 game does not work on an NTSC N64, but US carts work on Japanese N64 with some modifications to the N64's Kart's plastic. Nintendo opted for the cartridge format for the N64, even though CD-ROM, which had much higher capacity, was favoured by others, such as Sony and Sega, for their PlayStation and Saturn. To complement the N64's main form of storage, the 64DD add-on used magneto-optical discs, while having lower storage than CD-ROM, had the advantage of being writable. The intention was that certain games could use both cartridge and 64DD format, with Zelda 64 being an example of a game that supposedly couldn't fit on a cartridge and would be a launch title for the 64DD. As we know, the 64DD sold poorly, and Sega had already shown with their Mega CD/Sega CD and 32X add-ons that the multi-format approach was a bad move. When we look at what the various formats had to offer, a CD-ROM could store about 650 megabytes, the 64DD disc 64 megabyte, and then 64 cartridge could store up to 64 megabyte also, although Edge only mentions 16 megabytes being soon available. It is a shame that the 64DD failed, as one can imagine how Ocarina of Time, for example, could have taken advantage of the writable nature of the 64DD. We see on this page a beta screenshot of Ocarina of Time, and below it a 64DD title called Creator, which never saw the light of day, which we only know to be a piece of creative software. Edge claims Super Mario 64 was the first game Nintendo worked on for the N64, and they praised it as the most memorable video game ever since the first groups of pixels crawled around the screen in the lights of Pong. Edge also goes on to say that throughout the game, the N64 generates the most impressive graphics ever seen in the home, but points out that the game's only faults are the occasionally awkward camera work and the rather too revolutionary nature of some of the in-game hint points, which can occasionally spoil the sense of discovery somewhat. 10 out of 10 from Edge. The flight sim Pilotwings 64 was also well received, with Edge remarking that it contains some of the most complex 3D environments seen in an N64 game to date. Edge said that the graphics are truly stunning, and that it's a challenging, addictive game which just happens to boast some of the finest 3D graphics to date on any platform. It may not have the immediate cutesy appeal of Mario 64, but it does have plenty to offer in terms of gameplay, scope and inventiveness. 9 out of 10 from Edge. Shadows of the Empire was not so well liked by Edge. He commented that there was little to recommend it but a great license, a few moments which capture the unique flavour of the movie trilogy, and very occasionally a tantalising glimpse of what might have been had the game been overseen more closely, and bland, incredibly short corridor sections with almost no variety of opponents, a conspicuous lack of secret areas, and no puzzle-style elements suggests that Lucas has learned little since the disappointing Dark Forces. Ouch. 6 out of 10 from Edge. Now for some beta, starting with Zelda 64, which was supposed to be a 64DD launch title, but instead was released as a cartridge game in late 1998 as Ocarina of Time. Have a good look at the beta screenshots, notice the houses, Link with a beta shield, and the early design for the Stealthers. The HUD has a different layout to the final, the so-called A+B interface, and there are 0123 rupees, most likely a test amount. Edge says Link will have to face off with Ganon, must be Ganon's cousin. On this page we have Link battling what looks to be an early version of the Iron Knuckle enemy, and an odd looking room with coloured squares, which is possibly a beta Stealthers mini-boss room. Also there is a series of screens showing Link obtaining the Triforce, as from a famous beta video. Most interestingly, it's claimed by other sources that this room uses Super Mario 64 textures. In one screenshot we see that Link has the ability to jump at will, instead of the auto jump mechanism in the released game. Yoshi's Island 64, which will become Yoshi's Story, is a sequel to Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island, and was released late 1997 in Japan and early 1998 in other regions. On this page we have some beta screens which have no smile meter, but interestingly instead we see smiley flowers as possibly collectible items. There is no fruit frame, that is, the collected fruit shown around the edges of the screen. In one image we can just about see a beta question mark block in the bottom right, appearing at an angle. In another screenshot there is a fuzzy wiggler, only found in stage 1-2 in the release game, but that level looks very different to the final game if it was supposed to be the same level. What may be stage 4-3 can be found in another image. The background piranha plants more visible and with different looking platforms than in the release game. We have a beta version of stage 4-1, Jungle Hut, with a different stage design, and what looks to be an early version of World 3-4, Frustration, showing a lack of 2 having a slightly different look. Next we will look at Mother 3, aka Earthbound 64, which would have debuted on the 64DD, but was cancelled in August 2000 for the N64, but was eventually released in a new form on the GBA in April 2006, Japan only, so all images on this page are beta. This would have been the first 3D Mother game, and Edge claims that the 3-player characters would have been Duster, Mystery Merchandiser, and Luca, likely Lucas. The game would have taken advantage of the 64DD's writable nature to track changes the player makes to the game world. In the various screenshots we see, Edge highlight the jump in graphical detail compared to Mother 2, and in one image we see a very large range of characters. In other screens we are treated to just a small number of different locations the player will come across. Lastly, we have a couple pieces of concept artwork from Ape, who had previously worked on the Mother series. In the last few pages, we will look at a list of key games that are expected to be released on the N64, and I've highlighted those that never made it to the N64. In this list of 1997 releases for the N64, I've outlined all of the games that never made it to the N64 in 1997 or later. Note that of the games that were actually released on the N64, some of them were only available in Japan. While it may seem a shame that these games never made it to the N64, some of them later appeared on other Nintendo hardware, such as Kirby's Air Ride, which ended up on the GameCube in Japan and North America in 2003, and Europe and Australasia in 2004. Other games would see life on non-Nintendo formats, with Jurassic Park 2 The Lost World being an example, released in late 1997 in North America and Europe on the PS1 and Sega Saturn. I would like to end by quoting a bit of Edge's closing words. With favourites such as Castlevania, Contra, and Metroid rumoured to already be in development, it would be a brave man indeed that would predict anything but eventual global success for the Nintendo 64. The defection of Enix and Square to the PlayStation has certainly taken the shine off the impending 64DD launch, but Nintendo has, in Zelda 64, a game capable of single-handedly ensuring the Peripherals' success, in the same way Super Mario 64 assured the base N64 unit a place in millions of homes. The future is almost here. Thanks for watching. Despite my best efforts at research, please do leave a comment if I made a mistake, or perhaps you have something interesting to add. Please check out the video description for links to further information about the games featured. Bye for now.